Kaya Wanju, hello and welcome. My name is Shamit Sagar. I'm a professor at the University of Western Australia here on the west coast of Australia. And in addition to that, I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute. So you're very welcome to join us an hour or so before the sun sets in the very early part of spring in the Southern Hemisphere here on the west coast. I'm delighted that this evening we're partnering with the UWA Graduate School of Education on this vital long-term topic, the future health and prosperity and indeed well-being of Australia. This is part and parcel of the kind of work that characterises the work of the Institute more generally. For those of you not familiar, the Institute was established at the back end of 2018 in common with a pattern across many research-intensive universities across the world to ensure that the fruits of their world-class research was more swiftly put in the hands of decision makers in government, in business, in non-profits and campaign groups. We're pursuing all of that as part of our mission, and I encourage you, when you get a moment, to take a look at our work in detail on our website. So this is a really opportune time to have a discussion about Australia's schools, schooling, education, attainment, and long-term vision and progress against that. It's been a decade or so since the last important attempt was made to both restructure the arrangements, but also the incentives within those structures. In the earlier part of this year, as some of you will be aware, here in Australia, we have had a new federal government elected, and with that, a brand new federal minister for education. Along with that, of course, comes a new national school reform agreement, which is likely to be considered not so long from now, possibly in early 2023. So all these tributaries are flowing in the direction of having the conversation that we're about to have in a moment. Those of you will also noticed that here in Australia, we have a Jobs and Skills Summit taking place, which is part and parcel of discussing how well Australia is positioned to deal with economic challenges of renewal, labour market shortages, productivity, and ultimately our place in the economic and trading world. So education and what happens in the compulsory schooling system is by no means unimportant as part of that discussion. You haven't actually tuned in to hear from me at any great length. I'm going to get out of the way. My job is merely to provide some degree of introduction at the very start. It's my great pleasure now to hand you over and put you in the capable hands of my colleague, Professor Glenn Savage, who's an associate professor here at UWA and also a fellow of the Public Policy Institute. Glenn, over to you.
Thank you, Shamit, and good evening, everyone. Look, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening, today, this morning, whatever it is for you, for what I think will be a really valuable discussion about the future of schooling in our nation. So my name's Glenn Savage, and I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in Perth, Western Australia. I'm an Associate Professor of Education Policy here at the Graduate School of Education, and it's really good to be working with the Public Policy Institute to host this event. Online today, I can see that there's scholars, there's students, there's policymakers, there's educators, and there's members of the public from across the nation and beyond. So it represents a really rich and diverse set of experiences, histories, and relationships to education. The response to this webinar, and we were talking about this just before, has been remarkably positive, overwhelming. And I think the large number of you who've taken the time out of your evenings tonight to chew the fat over the future of our nation's schools. Our desire in putting this webinar together is to generate public-facing debate about what the next era of Australian schooling policy should look like. It seems to me that Australia is at a pivotal moment, with decisions soon to be made by education ministers that have the potential to set a new course for our nation's schools. As Shamit just said, with the new federal minister, a new national school reform agreement that needs to be established, I feel like we've got a golden opportunity to influence the shape of education reform in the decade to come. This invites many, many questions, not only about where we've come from and the successes or otherwise of the strategies put in place, but also bigger and harder questions, I think, about where we want to go. What kind of schools do we want to imagine for our educators, parents, and young people? What might need to change? What should stay the same? I pose these questions against the backdrop, or some might say the aftermath, of two of the most transformative decades of schooling reform our nation has seen. If we go back in time to the late 2000s, which to me doesn't seem that long ago, we'll all remember that the Labor government's promise of an education revolution was based around wide-scale attempts to transform core elements of schooling across the Federation. If it weren't for the education revolution, we probably wouldn't have a national curriculum, national literacy and numeracy testing, national teaching standards, the Gonski funding model, or many of the national measurement and reporting mechanisms that now shape the work of governments. Or at the very least, these things might have evolved, but they would have looked very different. Now, I know there's many of you in the audience who would point to the important gains made by many of these reforms. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that there have been positive things about our recent era of reform, not least of which are powerful new forms of intergovernmental cooperation, policy co-design, and the cross-pollination of ideas and evidence across the country. But on the flip side, there's also an increasing and hard to ignore body of evidence that tells us that some of these grand attempts to revolutionise schools are not working the way they were supposed to. And what we're seeing in 2022 is a portrait very different, I think, from the Gideon heights of improvement once imagined. Not only has Australia gone into rapid freefall on key measures of performance like PISA testing, but other measures have also stagnated or gone backwards, replicating historically ingrained patterns. Roughly 1 in 5 young people in Australia don't complete Year 12. There's intolerable differences in outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. The race for high ATARs and entry to elite universities continues to be dominated by young people from the wealthiest backgrounds. And despite unprecedented levels of funding for schools, public schools continue to remain underfunded compared with private schools when measured against the Gonski funding model that was supposed to deliver greater fairness. So we inhabit, I think, a kind of post-revolutionary moment in which much has changed, but much has also failed to change. Or put differently, a lot has gone on at great expense, but many key indicators have stayed the same or gotten worse. Why is this the case? What have we done wrong? And what do we need to do differently? So these are the sorts of questions that we'll be dealing with this evening. And I'm really excited to be joined by a really diverse and dynamic group of experts to talk through these ideas. Joining us tonight, we have, and thank you to all of them, Laureate Professor Jenny Gore, who is Director of the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre at the University of Newcastle. We have Dr. Zid Manzanito, Senior Manager of Research and Evaluation for the Australian Education Research Organisation, aka AERO. We have Bevan Ripp, President of the Principals Federation of Western Australia. And we have Dr. Marnie Shea, Senior Research Fellow at the School of Education at the University of Queensland. So what I'm going to do tonight is we're going to talk as a group, engage in conversation for about 45 minutes. And after that, we'll convene a Q&A session for the remainder of the event. So we really want to throw it open to you, the audience, to ask questions to our panel. And so if you're going to do this, can you please put your questions in the Q&A function? You'll see down the bottom in the webinar, not in the chat. You can chat as much as you want, but the Q&A is where we want to put the questions, and I'll try and monitor them as we go along. So enough from me. I'm going to put the panelists on the spot, and this hasn't been pre-planned, so it could go a bit pear-shaped. But what I want to do just to start with is to ask each of you to come up with one word, so just one word, that you feel symbolises the past 2 decades of education reform in this country. So I'll just pause there to give you a second to think about it. So one word that symbolises the recent era of schooling reform in our nation. And Bevan, I'm sorry, but I'm going to put you on the spot and make you go first. What do you reckon? What's one word?
Politicised.
What's that, sorry?
Politicised.
Politicised. Okay, Jenny, what do you think?
I'm going to say piecemeal.
Marnie?
Changing.
And Zid, what do you think?
I actually had piecemeal, but let's say lots.
Okay, it's really interesting that two of you were going to go with exactly the same descriptor, piecemeal. So, I mean, Jenny and Zid, what makes you look back at the last decade or so and go, this has been piecemeal?
I might go first then, Zid, since I'm unmuted. There's been so many frameworks, collaborations, plans made, opportunities sort of developed partially, but then we've failed to implement and failed to sort of stitch things together for a system-wide view. And I think there's many examples of that, which can be explained partly by our politics, partly by the kind of federal system of states and territories, partly by the misunderstanding and misuse of evidence, partly by the kind of many layers of the education system that are not necessarily pulling in the right, not in the right direction, who knows what the right direction is, pulling in the same direction. So just working at cross purposes. And I think also one final piece of that is the attempt to kind of address education in isolation from the larger complex set of issues that shape what happens as a result of schooling.
So, Jenny, I was at the WA Primary Principals Association conference today in Perth, and so many of the things that you just said was exactly what principals were saying. They were saying, we get told to do this, there's another new initiative, you know, there's a new set of indicators that tell us what works. But when do we have time to do all this? And when can we see it through to its, you know, more mature moment, I guess? Like, where's the support to enact something that's been brought out? So Zid, were you thinking something similar to Jenny, or did you have another view on piecemeal?
Exactly the same thing. I think that one thing that we hear over and over again from teachers, school leaders, policymakers in our conversations at Arrow is how many things are happening all across the architecture, and how sometimes they speak to each other and other times they don't, and how we need to be trying to advance towards some sort of coherence. I think I agree with that, but I also think that there's a challenge to try to figure out, you know, what is a coherent message when it comes to doing education. There's so many ways of approaching it. There's so many things that different people believe that are important in education. What is really going to bring us all together and say, yeah, we agree, this is the next step. And so I think that the new NSRA is a really exciting opportunity for us to try to get on the same page.
So Bevan, you said politicized, and I'm going to come back to that. We'll park that because we're going to talk about politics a little bit later. But Marnie, you said changing, and I'm interested, you know, your research, Marnie, focuses or sort of works at that nexus between Indigenous education and policy studies. I mean, when you look back at the past decade with that lens of Indigenous students, I mean, what do you think has changed? I mean, what gains have been made? Are there gains, or have the gains been few and far between?
Well, in terms of policy reform, there's definitely been change. I mean, the fact that, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures is a national cross-curriculum priority. The fact that we have 2 national standards that explicitly speak to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education, they're pretty big changes. Yeah. There's a whole range of things that have happened in the policy space, but I don't think it's quite kept up with the accelerated way in which people are expecting things to change. So we've had some global movements happen, like, well, the pandemic's one, but Black Lives Matter, for instance. That's had a big impact here socially, culturally, politically in Australia. And we've seen that filter through to education contexts like universities and schools. People are wanting change. And yeah, I don't think that schools have been provided and equipped with resources to enact those changes very well.
Can I also ask you, Marnie, like, as you're speaking, I'm thinking often when people talk about Indigenous students or Indigenous performance or Indigenous schools, they suddenly start talking about the gap, and the conversation starts to be about the gap or closing the gap. And I just wonder, I mean, do you think that's the right way that we should be talking about this? Or do you think that there needs to be another way of framing those differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students?
Well, I think language matters. We all know that. And the way that people interpret particular messaging through language matters. And, you know, about 3 or 4 years ago, some colleagues and I were yarning about this idea about closing the gap, and the ideas that people absorb when they think about Indigenous education as closing the gap.
Yeah.
Essentially, they miss out on knowing the impact of Indigenous education for all Australian students, for one. Secondly, it problematizes Indigenous students, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I started to say to one of my colleagues, you know, our people are talking about excellence quite broadly and have been for some time. You know, there's a Centre of Excellence in Redfern, a Centre for Indigenous Excellence.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do was just see if there was anything on Google that's talked about excellence and Indigenous education. And the saddest thing was there was nothing. There's nothing that connected those two ideas. So we've actually been doing some research over the past few years to see how people conceptualize it. And it's an endeavor of getting people to think differently. And it's really interesting to see when we're talking to principals, schools, you know, school staff who are doing a range of roles. When we just introduce the topic, it's quite jarring for people because they haven't been able to think in that way before, so, or act in that way, or think about their practice in that way. So
because it sort of jars the logic or the assumptions of the presence to talk about it in more aspirational terms, I guess, than the gap discourse, which has always got that deficit of where people are not at, right, attached to it. I just want to shift to the teaching profession, because I mean, all I get asked about lately is the teaching profession, right? The problems of the teaching profession, the problems of teacher quality, the problems of teacher training. And I mean, it seems if you work in a university, this is the debate that we're having around what we do and what our purpose is. So Jenny, I mean, your work is deeply connected to the teaching profession and issues and opportunities facing it. And, you know, for more than a decade, I feel, or maybe more, we've been having this debate about teacher quality, preparation, how do we attract, how do we maintain the best teachers and so on. But it seems to me like a remarkable amount of effort and money has been spent on this. You know, particularly when you look at things like the cost of rolling out national teaching standards or, you know, other things linked to that. How effective I asked Marnie how effective she thinks her main area has been. How effective has yours been? I mean, have we done the right thing here in terms of these large scale efforts to transform the teaching profession, or are we doing it, you know, a way that could be, or could we be doing it a much better way?
Yeah, I think the answer's in the framing of the question in part, Glenn. We could obviously be doing much better than we are. I think that, as you say, the huge investment in the development of standards, the system for accrediting people as highly accomplished and lead teachers that very few have actually taken up, the introduction of the Landtight testing that very few students actually fail, the introduction of the teaching performance assessments, the layers upon layers. You know, in New South Wales, we have the elaborations of the teaching standards because the teaching standards weren't as explicit as perhaps they wanted them to be on certain topics. So we've, as you say, sort of developed this whole architecture of regulation of hurdles. I guess they're often experienced as hurdles for teacher educators and teacher education students that in the end have made very little difference to their experience. And I think one of the things that troubles me the most is we keep talking about the need to raise the status of teaching, and yet we over-regulate entry into initial teacher education. We over-regulate teacher education itself in ways that can actually deter the very students we seek to attract. A lot of the reform, if we call it that, that's happened in initial teacher education is not based on evidence. It's based on assumptions. So, you know, one of the key ones is this mantra that we must recruit the best and brightest to the teaching profession based on ATAR scores. Or, you know, similar equivalent measures. And of course, we want smart, caring, wonderful people working with our children, but we don't even have evidence that ATARs make for better teachers. So we need a much better system of evidence within the kind of teacher education and broader teacher development life cycle on which to base policy. So I think one of the really important things that can be done is to invest in the development of such a body of evidence. And at the moment, educational research gets 2% of Australian Research Council funding as an example of how there's so much more that could and should be done.
There's so much to unpack there, and that point on evidence we're going to come back to and talk about in a bit of detail. But Bevan, I just want to bring you into it and come back to that notion of the politics, because I suspect that what Jenny's saying here about, you know, that we like to talk about ATAR scores and the best and brightest, and that becomes sort of like a soundbite that we hear, you know, and it's sort of one of those things, right? Who's going to disagree? Like, who's going to disagree that people need to be smart to be teachers, right? But I do feel that it's missing the point sometimes. And I mean, what we've also seen, and obviously, Bevan, you're speaking here from a principals representation perspective. I feel like principals are tired. There's a lot of change fatigue. You know, COVID seems to have shone a light on an already existing problem of teacher shortages. And it's raised bigger questions, I think, about whether we're even going to have the teachers or the school leaders that we need in the classrooms of the future. So speaking from, or as you see it from your perspective, I mean, what's your reading of this climate that we're talking about? Should we be worried about the current state of the profession? And will governments be able to put a quality teacher in front of kids in the years to come?
Look, Glenn, I think everything that's been said so far is quite accurate. And I've put the word politicisation there because it actually sits over the top of why Jenny, you know, and Zid came up with piecemeal, because it is piecemeal because of the politics that sits over the top of all of this. Things change, seems to be quite rapidly. We never seem to get to an effective outcome at the school level. There's the gap between policy development at the national level to how it looks when the rubber hits the road in schools. It's the Grand Canyon between the two. Mm-hmm. And so what principals are concerned about in terms of what's down the track for us in terms of being able to attract people into the profession. One of the first problems we see is that people going into university to study a teacher's degree, at the moment, that degree is seen as much lesser in status than, say, if you were looking at being a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or whatever. That has to be rectified in the eyes of the community. I mean, teaching has to be returned to that elevated level. And I mean, Indigenous cultures revered their teachers. Their teachers were their storytellers. They were the keepers of the culture. We almost have to have a deep, hard look at ourselves as a modern society and the role of the teacher in that sort of way. Now, attracting people is one thing. There is data there at the moment that's quite frightening in terms of, at the moment, we're expecting about half the number of graduates out of teacher degree than we usually get. Yeah. We find a rate of people leaving the profession in the first 5 years is alarming, 25%. We don't have by the time we get to 5 years. If we can get them there, then there's a fair chance we'll keep them. But there's a real challenge for when we have graduates entering schools, appointed to positions. There needs to be a much greater investment in supporting those people to get through those first couple of years, because in spite of what some people have in their mind about teaching as a job, a vocation, it's hard work. If you're going to do this job well, it is hard work, and there's no other description for it. So they need support.
So this is just a question to anyone who wants to pick it up here. But I mean, when you start to, I'm listening to you talking, Bevan, and I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, what is policy, right? If not for what happens in front of a kid in a school. I mean, at the end of the day, right, when you say when the rubber hits the road, but like, you know, people often talk about the system as if it's out here. and then, people in schools in here, but I think, I think it possibly Ken Robinson who said this, like teachers are the system, for a kid, the system is their teacher, and so you're outlining all these really concerning issues that we're facing over the next decade or so. But I'm wondering, as a scholar of federalism, where do you have to intervene in this for the most benefit? So is this something we need a national approach to? So would we like to see something on this in the National School Reform Agreement? We currently have a focus in the current agreement on teacher, preparation and so on. But do we need to expand that to a broader focus on the profession to deal with some of these issues at the national scale? And some people say yes. Or is this a state or sector or more local issue that it would be better dealt with at a different level? So, I mean, I'm looking at Zid and Jenny just because I know you've probably got both lots to say on this. But would either of you or anyone like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think that the previous NSRA, the national policy initiatives, or even previous national agreements have really shown us is that we really need a systemic approach rather than a fragmented approach to what our policy design is going to be. And that when the national policy initiatives work well, they work well because that they are reforming the sorts of structural things that are happening in our system. And so when we think about like what are the possibilities this time around, we can think about things like intensive learning support for low performing students, or sort of asking sort of more explicit system guidance around evidence-based teaching practices, or creating expert career pathways for teachers. These sorts of not just saying this is about funding, but this is about how we could be using our money better to really drive what works in the coalface.
So Zid, I've read the submission that Aero did to the National Productivity Commission's review of the National School Reform Agreement at the moment. And one thing that struck me in that submission was an argument that we do too much, we should be doing less and better and having follow through on it. So rather than, putting something out there and then not providing the structures and support to make it work, we put it out there and move on to the next thing. And I think that feeds into the kind of change fatigue that I was trying to get at before. So are you saying, Zid, then yes, we do need a national systemic approach, but we need the supporting infrastructure behind it?
100%. I think implementation is something that we don't pay enough attention to at the national level. I think that we have a lot of hopes and aspirations, and we have some really great policy ideas, but to actually get them implemented effectively so that change happens, it takes a lot of sustained time, thinking, and iterative development, and sort of commitment to, as Jenny flagged, developing the evidence as time goes on to really learn and iterate and change and grow. And that's something that we often don't have the opportunity to do, because the sorts of national policy cycles or media cycles mean that we're paying attention to this thing and then this thing and this thing, which often causes this sort of silver bullet mentality of, well, if we change ATAR minimums, then therefore we'll get better teachers. But no, that's just one piece of the puzzle of trying to make sure that we can have effective policy.
So Jenny, if you could put one thing in the new National School Reform Agreement that targeted the profession as it stands, what would it be?
I'd like to see a national, I'm ready for that one. I'd like to see a national teacher and school leader development strategy. We have a workforce strategy, but that's not about the really important part of all of this, which is how we support teachers to deliver great teaching. And for me, I really prefer to use the language of quality teaching rather than quality teachers, because I believe that we can help all teachers to deliver better quality teaching. So I really think that kind of a strategy would be really helpful, because what we're seeing, as we have seen with so many other reforms, is duplicated effort, wasted effort. We have so much energy that goes into planning. I once remember someone telling me that about 80% of effort goes into planning and 20% into implementation, and it really should be the other way around. And so we have endless frameworks and pillars and transformational collaborative co-design activities, all of which have value, and they're well thought out often, and there are great people who are contributing to the development of these things, but they fall over because the systems, the structures, the infrastructure is not in place. And so if some of the wisdom could be shared across jurisdictions, across states and territories. I'm involved at the moment in a middle leadership development program. I believe at least one or two of the other states are in the process of tendering for people to deliver middle leadership development programs. Why not get all of that work together and support the system for all middle leaders? But I also think that we also, through such a strategy, could have some bare minimum kind of requirements that all systems provide certain conditions for teacher induction, that all systems provide certain conditions for teacher development and leadership development, so that it isn't just left to the states and territories. Of course, they have a right to do their own thing to some extent, but couldn't we agree on a framework that would actually support teachers and help to keep them in the profession in ways that feel really meaningful?
So a lot of you are saying things that require us to think about what's the evidence base that's supporting these decisions that we make. So if we create a national strategy, or if we come up with a new national priority or set of standards or something like that, what are we working with? What's the knowledge and what's the evidence that we're working with that supports the justification for doing that in the first place, but then might guide what we do when we try and take it from policy as text or policy as aspiration through to policy as an enacted practice, from day to day. And, I feel like if you take a step back and you think about the logics or the assumptions that have driven the last decade of reform, I think it's pretty clear that governments have, at least on paper, committed themselves to what we'd call evidence-based or evidence-informed policy. So we hear people talk about we have to do what works. You've got various organisations and experts claiming to tell us what works to improve schools in different ways. We have organisations like AeroZid that's been established, and you're the senior manager of research, and a lot of people would be really interested, I think, to know how a group like Aero positions itself, in this evidence landscape and how you're thinking about it. So possibly this is a question for you, Zid, but to everyone more broadly, my question is, how do we decide what quality evidence looks like? So if we want to say we're going to do certain things at the national scale, and we're going to support that with quality evidence, how on earth do we land on what that evidence is?
I agree with your diagnosis. I think that we've done really, really well over the past 20 years to get people talking about data, talking about evidence. And I can't sort of walk into a room without tripping over someone being like, well, this is evidence-based, or here's the data. The thing is, not all evidence is good evidence. And we need to recognize that. And I think that's the exciting place that Aero can really contribute over the next 20 years, really trying to help establish in the national architecture, how do we differentiate between good evidence, evidence that we can have confidence in, that can help us make really high stakes decisions, and evidence which, we can take a bit of a punt on. We can be like, all right, maybe, but we need a little bit more information before we make some really big decisions. And so that's why Aero has developed our standards of evidence, standards which both look at the sort of rigor of that evidence in terms of identifying the causal effect of something, whether or not something's actually got an impact, and its relevance, whether or not this is actually relevant to our particular context, relevant to the students that it's going to impact, relevant to the teachers in the schools that we're working in. And so that's the sort of start. Look, it's only a start, but it's the beginning of helping us really at a national level try to say, how do we differentiate between stuff that's just, good to think with, and stuff which is, this is where we should put our money in.
And Zid, if I was a principal, if I was a teacher, how would you want me to be relating to Aero? Like, how would you want me to be using their materials? Who's your target audience here?
Yeah, I think that's stuff that we are, I think educators, teachers, school leaders are one of our primary audiences. We really want to be able to find ways to provide simple, practical guidance that can help educators, teachers, and school leaders know what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis. There's so many tiny decisions that they have to be making, so much cognitive load. Anything we can do to lift that is one of the key reasons why Aero is around. But we also know that systems have so many complicated layers that make it such a complex job, and that we need to be working through systems to have coherence in the system. So it's not just teachers and school leaders getting information from everywhere. And so we're working at two speeds here, and it's hard because you're right, it's a federal system, and all the states and territories are working on different things in different paces with different priorities. But the headline is the AIRA is here to help, both at the system level and direct to schools and teachers.
So Bevan, I mean, if you're a principal in a school, you know, you've got ACARA provides advice on things, you've got AITSL provides advice on things, AIRA is now providing advice on things, you've got your government bureaucracy apparatus providing advice, you've potentially got think tanks and websites and all this other stuff. How does a principal sift through this information and go, this is what's going to work for me, or at least this is what might work for me in this context?
That's a really difficult question, Glenn. The problem from a principal's perspective is that caught up in all of this, there's a compliance agenda as well. Yeah. So the capacity to work with your staff to concentrate on what is the core business of a school, which is the development of the child. And we're talking about the whole child, not just talking about teaching a subject or anything like that. It's working with the whole child. And we're finding less and less time to do that because of the compliance agenda that's forced upon schools. I'll just use an example here about the incapacity, let's say, of governments to actually learn from other jurisdictions, learn from what's happened before. I mean, in this latest agreement, there was the development of the national curriculum and the summative assessments, which were termed as learning progressions. Now, over here in WA, we had a thing called outcomes-based education back in the 2000s. An absolute debacle. Cost a bomb. Teachers didn't buy in. It was very, very difficult to try and get your heads around as to, you know, how it was going to work. The workload associated with it was horrendous. Learning progressions are going to be like that, and that's been written into the national curriculum. Now, we over here are absolutely aghast that might become something that we have to do again.
So, Bevan, is this an argument against national reform? And what I mean by that is, let's pretend that WA was Australia and we all did outcomes-based education and the whole thing was a nightmare. I often think if we all commit to the same thing and it fails, we all fail. But, you know, then maybe there's an argument here for diversity and competitive federalism, you know, and this is, again, speaks to my own interests here. But I just wonder, do we all need to do the same thing all the time? Or are there different ways of pursuing an agenda at the national scale that doesn't involve a set national consistent approach, but instead brings states and territories together into networks of collaboration where they may or may not want to do the same thing, but there's some broad goals that they might want to pursue?
I think there's some merit in that. I mean, the federal government is putting funding to education on a national level. But I think the funding should go to the states because constitutionally that's their remit. So let's have the federal government as a provider of funding to the states to enable their goals to be achieved. Okay, each state's got different contexts and there are different contexts within each state. I mean, if you look at WA, you know, the context for providing a schooling education for kids in the Kimberley compared to those in the Southwest, well, you're talking, you know, you can't make comparisons there. And you certainly wouldn't want to be trying to put a blanket that covers everything. I mean, the contexts are so vastly different. Well, so let's get the funding to them, but without maybe those conditions that the federal government seems to want to put on.
So Marnie, I've been itching to bring you in on this, and Bevan has provided me the perfect way in, because I mean, I was up in the Kimberley recently for an ARC project that I have, Australian Research Council project. And some principal up there was saying to me, look, when we talk about what works, like there's often this assumption, this sort of imagination of the leafy suburb, inner suburban school, and this is what's going to work there. And their view was like, that's not going to work here. Trust me. You know, and then they went on to try and explain why, you know, this particular, they're actually talking about high impact teaching strategies. And they were saying like, a lot of this stuff is not going to work for us here. Now, I'm not saying it is or isn't, that's just what he was saying. But do you think that the discussion about evidence shoots over the top or ignores some of the issues that are specific to Indigenous students who may not be in that typical school that is imagined?
Yeah, I'd probably make 2 points here. The first is that we have to acknowledge that the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education research to date has been done by non-Indigenous researchers.
Yeah.
So we have had a shift in expectations around research and knowledge production. We've had AATSIS develop ethical research guidelines, and HMRC have a similar version for health research with Indigenous people. And there's been a shift in terms of the expectations around Indigenous leadership, governance, data sovereignty, outcomes, impact, and all of those sorts of things. But my honest opinion is I haven't seen a lot of that translate into our field, into our discipline on a broad scale. I've seen lots of examples of how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education research has been done quite well with Indigenous, non-Indigenous collaborators, but that's been a recent thing. So when schools and policymakers talk about evidence in Indigenous education, often they're drawing from really dated ideas.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm trying to argue in some of the work that I'm doing that, you know, we need to move towards an idea of Indigenous-based evidence. So it must be based on the voices, aspirations, experiences of our people, because we're the subjects of whatever is decided at a policy level. That's what it boils down to. And we can't afford for another generation to, you know, have stagnated impacts and outcomes.
And I think what you're getting at is actually like there's a deeper question here about how we understand evidence, isn't it? Like it's not just about here's the evidence, like let you do it in the school, but how we can actually produce our own evidence in context that might have more relevance and meaning to those whose lives these decisions affect.
There is, and there's subjectivities and biases in how people accept evidence. Or as Zid was saying, you know, what people decide is robust evidence or good evidence or not so good evidence. And, you know, we have to also be real about the, you know, power differentials in that. You've got race, gender, class, all sorts of kind of things swirling around there as people make decisions about what is good evidence. And in our setting, in an Indigenous setting, that's a constant barrier for a lot of our people. When we're coming to the table, we're bringing, you know, often our elders are bringing decades and decades and decades of advocacy and knowledge and experience, and they're overlooked because they haven't done a 3-year ARC study, but they've lived for the last 5 decades in you know, advocating for better outcomes for our young people. So yeah, that's a topic I'm quite passionate about.
No, I can see. And I mean, Jenny, with your work, with your research group, I mean, do you think that there's enough focus in research when we're preparing teachers, having conversations about teacher quality or the quality of teachers, on preparing Indigenous or non-Indigenous teachers to work with Indigenous students? Because I can say that when I went through my teaching degree, very poor, if anything at all. I mean, it was another world that we didn't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing better, and certainly the standards require that, you know, all teacher education students are engaged to some extent with Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous education, Indigenous cultures, and so on. But I think there's much more to do there. The University of Newcastle actually has prepared more Indigenous teachers, I believe, than any other university in Australia. And we have a fabulous Indigenous unit here and fabulous Indigenous scholars. But even in a place like Newcastle, where we have that history and we have that sort of depth of expertise and really strong relationships within the institution, there's so much more that we could be doing. But I think it's really tricky because right now we've got to prepare teachers for so many diverse contexts, and they can be teaching out of field, they can be in remote areas, they can be in areas with lots of migrant students and so on. There's huge issues around mental health, there's issues around sexuality and so on that we need to prepare students to deal with. And so it's how we can find ways that enable our teachers, I was going to say young people, they're not necessarily all young, to have kind of the frameworks, the conceptual frameworks with which to think about the work that they're doing, rather than necessarily preparing them for every one of those outcomes. Having said that, we have an absolute responsibility to issues around reconciliation and First Nations people that I think is a critical part of every initial teacher ed program.
So what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that there's certain core competencies or knowledge that we need to teach trainee teachers to go into schools to do the profession. But then ultimately, you can't prepare everyone with a one-size-fits-all model, because when they get into schools, they're going to find quite diverse context. So just riffing off that, oh, sorry, did you want to?
Well, I would just say, like, this whole idea of one size fits all, we denigrate it, but there are things in common. Our contexts are incredibly diverse, but there are things in common about good teaching. It is to a large extent about relationships. It's about the way we treat students, the way we treat knowledge, and so on. What we do, even in research, is too often try and drill down to the kind of minute practices, as if we can just, teach teachers to improve their feedback, while, there are 25 other decisions they're making in any moment in the classroom. And that's where our own work is much more about a holistic understanding of good teaching and the core principles of good teaching, rather than this is what you need to do with this kind of student in this kind of school. And I think it's that conceptual, principled understanding of pedagogy, not as our governments seem to take it up with these kind of binary distinctions between direct and explicit instruction versus inquiry-oriented approaches, which Henry Giroux describes that. He calls it a stupid way that we have started to think of pedagogy, rather than understanding that pedagogy is about, that relationship between who we teach, what we teach, and how we teach. So I think one size fits all minute strategies is problematic, but one size fits all agreed conceptual frameworks for how we understand good teaching and how we support teachers and learners actually can be very powerful. And we have some good evidence of that.
Yeah, so sort of general principles of practice that can be differently applied in different local spaces. And as I say this, I just realized I was on a permaculture course recently. It's exactly why the permaculturalists talk about pathways and principles rather than saying this is what you have to do, because every garden is different, every climate is different. But Jenny, what I was going to say based on that idea was that, we're hearing governments or some stakeholders arguing that more teacher preparation should be in the school, rather than in the university. So I'm just wondering to what, and then others arguing we have to do that, otherwise we're going to not be able to deal with the teacher shortage issue. So I'm just wondering where you see, like, obviously the role of the university is important in your view for those broader principles and practices, but like, should more be done in schools, like, so that we can learn the craft of teaching in situ?
When I did my undergraduate physical education degree in Adelaide 100 years ago, we were taught about the importance of perfect practice, not just practice. And so I think having time in schools is really important, but we need good models of practice. And right now, putting third and fourth year teacher ed students into schools when teachers are under enormous, and school leaders are under enormous pressure, and many of them are saying they're not getting much time to teach because they're busy managing combined classes and kids out on the oval and whatever. I think we have to be really careful about the assumption that school-based apprenticeship models are powerful. Right. Many years ago, I wrote a paper called can't remember, but looking at the 4 kind of paradigms of teacher education. One is that we need a strong disciplinary base. You know, you just need to know your stuff and you'll be a good teacher. The second is you need apprenticeship models, just watch and learn. Third is that it's a science of teaching and we just have to, you know, break it down and figure out what works skill by skill and put it all together. And fourth is that we need a social justice perspective on teacher education. And my view is that we've actually done ourselves no favors by fighting these sort of different paradigmatic perspectives on initial teacher education. All 4 of those areas are absolutely critical to an effective teacher education. That's how we bring them together that I think is where the power lies. And whether that's based in schools or not, it's about having those really strong systems of meaningful support for teachers that enable them to play their role in the education of beginning teachers.
So, I mean, as I said before, the National Productivity Commission is reviewing the current National School Reform Agreement, and they're trying to, you know, say, what have we done well? What hasn't worked so well? Are we using the right measures? Like, are we transparent and accountable enough in the ways that we're trying to understand this? But they're also interested in whether or not the Federation itself is sort of set up in the right way or operating in the right way to inspire collaboration, you know, and to inspire co-design and those kind of nice concepts, you know, that we'd like to think are happening at the intergovernmental level. How can federal, state and territory governments work together better? Now, what better means, that's up to you guys to decide, but how can they work better together to do that kind of collaborative and co-design work towards better education reforms? And again, I'm looking at you, Zid, because I know that you're in the thick of this, given that Aero, I reckon Aero, they used to talk about the holy trinity, right, of ACARA, AITSU and ESA. I think there's a fourth one in the holy trinity. How are you working that space?
Look, you know, I have a vested interest, you know, that I have a favorite child out of that, out of those 4. But I think often about the sort of national review of the education architecture, which talked about some of these questions. And I think there's over the past 10 years, there has been, unfortunately, this sort of polarization between the feds and the state about, you know, how we should be doing education reform. And I think that Aero does have a responsibility here, trying to figure out how can we bring these sides a little bit closer together. Look, I think that the particular benefit of Aero is that we're not a regulator here. We're not trying to say, here are minimum standards. We're here to try to help provide independent advice that can get us a little bit closer to figuring out how do we pace reform? How do we, you know, get everyone understanding what is their part to play in advancing the sorts of outcomes that we're after. I think that when you flagged earlier the challenge of sort of competitive federalism, and you're excited about it, but I think in order for competitive federalism to work, we need full information about what's actually having an impact, and we need all of the actors to have the ability to change, to not feel so institutionally burdened by what they're actually doing that they can't actually learn and change from other places. And I think that a really exciting role of national agencies is the ability to sort of look up and step back and not be so encumbered by the actual day-to-day, to actually say, you know, what can we learn from looking across the different states and territories to help give states and territories and the federal government more information about what's effective, but then also just to nudge different states and territories, the federal government, into helping them change so that they're not so institutionally burdened by their past choices, so they can make evidence-based decisions.
And I suspect as well, Zid, that, you know, I mean, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I'm, you know, fanboy for competitive federalism, because I think there's definitely some downsides to that as well. And, you know, I did a bigger project on this, and one of the things I found was that states are so unequally positioned to engage in competitive federalism. And, you know, a state like Tasmania, right, from a resource and bureaucracy perspective, can't engage and give as much as a state like, you know, New South Wales can. So I definitely don't want to sort of suggest that there's some lovely world where everyone's just sharing and collaborating. But on that note, like someone told me the other day, oh, what's the point? What's the point in worrying about, like, you know, whether education reform can be better at the national level? It's just all about politics anyway. Like, it's just all about, you know, what the next federal minister wants or what the state ministers want. And there's no real discussion here about what's best. It's just all about, like, you know, getting one up on each other. So, I mean, Bevan, I'm looking at you because your politicisation message at the start. But any of you, do you want to comment on whether you think that the politics are just, you know, can you get past them here in this debate?
Glenn, I think to get to your point about the competitive federalism, I mean, that's okay if we can take the politics out of the equation. So it doesn't matter which side of politics is in government in a state or another state or federally. Let's take the politics out of the education discussion. What we need to bring it back to is that no matter which side of politics you are on, you have a basic core belief that that education is an investment in the country. It is not a cost to the taxpayer, it's an investment. So the change of language there. The second part of it for me is when it comes down to how we see teachers in the grand scheme of things compared to other professions. Now, I'd like to think that teachers are actually nation builders. Let's bring the language around to the work they do is that important, that they are nation builders here. And it's not just those who engage in infrastructure projects and things like that that are building the nation. It is the teachers of this country that are working with tomorrow's citizens that are actually building this nation and making it a better place. That is the belief that we need to see emerge at a political level, regardless of what side of politics they're on. So
everyone, this is a question to everyone. The National School Reform Agreement, this would be my last one before we segue into our Q&A, because I can see there's a few questions there already, and please add more people if you want the panelists to address them. Funding, I've left it for last because it's just a tough one, right? And obviously the National School Reform Agreement has an intimate relationship to the various acts and funding agreements that exist, and money needs to be tied to strategies need to be tied to evidence. So in a way, it all kind of like comes back to this question about funding. And look, I look back at the last two Gonski reports, you know, I look at the development of the SRS funding model, and I'm a little bit disappointed in some ways. Like, I feel like there was this moment of recognition of great inequalities of provision and access for different students across the country. And we somehow have fallen short again of where we wanted to be. And I always say this, if your child goes to a public school, they're pretty much underfunded compared to the Gonski funding model than they are if they go to a private school. How have we ended up where we are? And what do we need to do in this next round to try and make the funding debate a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more beneficial for the students who need the most money and the most resources?
I'll jump in and just say, you know, it is such a disappointment and such a pity that all of that great work hasn't been capitalised upon, largely, as Bevan has put it, because of politics. What we really need is a long-term vision of a whole system of reform that goes even beyond school funding to look at how we address those broader structural disadvantages that education alone cannot fix. So it's a real whole of government, whole of system response that I think is needed. And somehow, as you say, taking the politics out of it, which is impossible, but to at the very least keep the focus on what is most important, and that is supporting teachers and school leaders to deliver the kind of education we want for all children. And we lose sight of that all the time, I think, in Australian education reform initiatives. So I'm just echoing the disappointment, really, but I do think we have a way forward, and that is for that kind of meaningful investment in things that we know can work, rather than back to the piecemeal small initiatives that don't go anywhere. I will just say small initiatives can be important. Tony Bright once says that we need to implement slowly and learn quickly. And we tend to do the opposite, which is that we implement something in a great big rush, it fails, and then we jump onto the next thing. And as you said earlier, we never arrive at that point where, we're really making the kind of difference we need to make.
I do definitely agree, though, Jenny, that you can't get the politics out of it. And I hope that's not what I was implying earlier. But, I guess I'm trying to think about ways in which we could, I can't get the right word here, but, like move beyond the politics. So again, that's wrong. But I mean, one of our attendees has posed a question here saying, why would the Commonwealth provide funding to states and territories without any assurance that it will be spent on evidence-based practice? And I think for me, like this cuts to the heart of a lot of this stuff, right? Because if the federal government is giving, increasing amount of money to states and territories, obviously they're going to want to see it linked to their preferences and priorities. But obviously that's going to have a political inflection to it, whether you want it to or not. So is the problem here, and I'm failing to articulate in my mind what I'm trying to say, but is the problem the very nature of the federation and the way in which schools are funded? Do we need another way of doing it? Do we need a national body that funds schools in a consistent measure where states and territories both put the money into, and then it goes out in a consistent way to schools without going through these different hoops and layers and multiple versions of needs-based funding that we have in our system? That's a question to anyone.
We should have a Savage review that tells us exactly how we should redesign the whole entire system. Look, I think that what Jenny's flagged is correct, that we can't just have the conversation about the quantum of money. We also have to be, because money doesn't automatically buy outcomes. There are things that buy outcomes and they cost money, and we just need to know what those things are. I think this all just harks back to the regular problem of policy implementation at federal level. Like, what's tight, what's loose, and how do we find the right setting for sort of national policy, and when do we give latitude and when don't we? I think that the truth, though, is that there are things that we know that do work, and there is some really strong evidence around how we support students who are really far behind their peers. And we know that small group one-on-one tutoring, when implemented effectively, does do that. We know that sort of instructional coaching that is very targeted around curriculum, that is consistent, that is based on a strong conception of what teaching and learning is, we know that has a real strong effect on improving teacher effective teaching quality. And so we can at the highest level say, this is where we should put our money, and this is where we should really say, this is what we believe in, and then allow states and territories, schools, principals to find the best ways that can work for them. And like, of course, that's easier said than done. The implementation of that is particularly challenging, as we've seen with the large tutoring initiatives out of many of the large states. But it is one way that we can help provide us with a little bit more confidence that all of the money that we're spending in this next NSRA is going towards things that we know have an impact.
So Zid, I'm going to start segueing us into more of the Q&A questions that are coming through, because there's a lot and they're quite detailed. But just before I do, I think there's an interesting thing going on in what you're saying, like a distinction between recurrent funding and then funding for specific initiatives. Because like, I would absolutely agree that, if you have a specific initiative, you want to fund initiatives that, you think are going to make a difference in some way. But I guess then there's the bigger question of the recurrent funding of schools and the sectors and who gets what, and I think those conversations probably, I'm sure you'd agree, would need to take place alongside each other. So I'm just looking at the questions, and I must say it requires some multitasking that I'm not sure I'm that good at, to read the questions and moderate at the same time. But someone's raised a really interesting question here about the quality of education policy. So they say, look, the quality of education policy impacts the quality of teaching and learning in the classroom. So I think most of us would agree with that, I'm sure, but they say rarely are policymakers held to account, and rarely do we analyse the quality of education policy. Are you confident in the quality of education policy making in Australia, locally and nationally? Would anyone like to pick that one off?
Sure, I'm happy to give a bit of a plug about a report that we recently released called Evidence Use in Education Policymaking. ERA recently investigated some issues influencing the effective use of evidence in policy development. And what we really found over and over again was that you need to be really intentional about the use of evidence in policy making. And that's not something that we have really consistent, we have a sense that is actually happening quite consistently. We have a lot of sort of policy borrowing, a lot of sort of generalized sense of like, well, it worked over there, therefore we should probably do it over here. And when we sort of surveyed school leaders and asked them, you know, how did you pick a particular program? Such a significant proportion of them said, well, I heard down there that it was pretty useful, and so that's why I decided to implement it. So I don't think we have that much confidence that the way that we're making decisions is really as evidence-based as we want them to be, but that there is hope in trying to create more clear structures for evidence-based policymaking with across Australia. I think that's one of the reasons why ERA was established as one of the national policy initiatives for the last NSRA, and one of the reasons why we're around.
Yeah, because of course ERA is a product of the NSRA, so you are living proof that it can produce something. So I mean, someone else has written here, a lot of educational research is very ordinary. So ERA's standards are a good development. I probably shouldn't respond to that as an ed policy researcher, but I mean, Bevan, can I throw to you, just because we were talking before about how a principal or a teacher might arrive at a decision, and this links to Zid's point just then about how people come to find evidence and put it into practice. What's your take on that? Like, how do you think of education research and the kinds of stuff that's done in our country? And, you know, do you see it as quality? Do you feel connected to the education research space?
I'll use an example here. Looking at the policy initiative, reviewing senior secondary pathways into work for their education and training. And I've sought some advice from a secondary principal recently, and his first three words were "danger, Will Robinson," because this looking at the policy as being idealistic and almost an outcomes-based education approach. So the question here is, what evidence was used to come up with that policy initiative? And you know, for us as principals, you know, leads into the discussion around vocation educational training. And as it is now, it is a major cost to schools. It's a drain on resources, and it's a high risk area. So although the concept being idealistic and can be very impractical, because schools shouldn't be viewed as being training providers. There are other organisations that do that. That I suppose is a good example of asking a question around, you know, where's the evidence to suggest that needed to be a policy initiative, and why schools should be thrust into that space when they're probably not well equipped to deal with it.
I can't remember who coined the term, but, you know, someone was saying we talk about evidence-based policy, but often what we get is policy-based evidence. You know, essentially the policy agenda driving the need to collect evidence to support the very agenda, you know, that's taking place. And I feel like you're getting at something similar to that.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, talking to secondary principals that are in that space, and they feel very exposed in a risk management sense, just dealing with that that aspect.
So my colleague and friend Jason Beach has put a question in there saying, I was very interested by the discussion on the specific needs, demands of the Indigenous communities, and was wondering if we should promote an Indigenous voice in education reform, a voice that not only influences education for Indigenous young people, but education for all Australians. So what would that voice look like, I wonder? Would anyone like to respond to Jason's comment if we should promote a voice, and what that would be?
Glenn, I think in WA there's I think some really good work being done in this space, cultural standards framework and that sort of thing. I think the issue comes of how we get outcomes that we seek for Indigenous education. It comes back to, again, the teacher quality and the teachers that go to particularly those communities that are predominantly Indigenous, First Nations, because we come back to, I think, and it's Jenny's point before about sometimes there's a blanket that goes over the lot we've got to look at. And in terms of preparation for teachers to go to some of these communities, their absolute understanding and belief that language and culture are everything. That's where your starting point is. And I mean, that probably should go across every part of our community, but it is particularly important in going into First Nations communities. Language and culture has to be that innate understanding that has to be at the very core of your teaching.
So Marnie, you mentioned before that, only relatively recently are we seeing a shift towards more Indigenous researchers producing research knowledge that then informs education reform. So I'm thinking about what Jason's question is here, and I'm thinking if we were to seek to promote more Indigenous voices in education reform, what role can be played by Indigenous researchers?
Can I just make a point first that Indigenous people are everywhere, Indigenous communities are everywhere. I just need to be really clear about that. In terms of Indigenous people and academics influencing education, that's been happening for a really long time as well. Actually, the very first education committee, I think, dated back to the 1930s. Education is a topic that a lot of our people, our elders, our aunties and uncles are very passionate about and have advocated for a really long time. And as I said, Indigenous academics are relatively new to the academy. But, I'm in a position where I'm fortunate to have had people to have paved the way for me. And now I've actually got a cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander PhD students now. I've got 4, it's so exciting. And what excites me about it is they're coming to the work, they're coming to the research with not only their lived experience, but their professional experience in education, in schools, in leadership, and they're conceiving of problems differently. And that's what we need. We need new ideas, we need new approaches. We can't keep rehashing the same old. And I think the challenge though, Glenn, is really not how much Indigenous research is happening and how many Indigenous academics we have at the table. It's how people listen and engage with it, and how it's perceived.
Or if they listen.
What's that? Sorry,
I said, or if they listen rather than how.
Yes, yeah. Or if you just, it's been an interesting journey for me, but
what an amazing position you're in to lead, a group like that who can potentially have quite a bit of impact over the future of these debates.
I hope so. Yeah, I'm very hopeful about that.
So Jenny, I'm going to throw you a different question. Someone said there's widespread acknowledgement of the importance of teaching quality, but how do we go about measuring it? It's like the $1 million question, isn't it?
It is a $1 million question, and we do have a way of measuring it that's really respectful of teachers and takes a really broad view, a holistic view of teaching. And teachers like it because it honours the complexity of teaching in a way that so many reforms, I guess, don't, or so many articulations of quality teaching fail to do. But we have to be really careful about how we use it. And so, years ago, I remember one of our peak bodies in Australia said, we love this quality teaching model you have. We can we can rank teachers, and graduate teachers might need to score here, and proficient teachers between these numbers, and accomplished teachers between other numbers. And we said it can't be used like that. We can't reduce it to systems of numerical systems that fail to take account of context. We have the same problem with all the talk about performance pay and merit pay for teachers, and even rewarding excellent teachers. You know, how do you tease out excellent teaching in the diverse context that we have? But we do have some really important insights about what quality teaching is. I often say at the same time, however, that it's one of the failures of our profession that we cannot seem to come to terms with what we mean by something as fundamental as quality teaching practice. And again, it's not about the minute practices of the classroom. It's about the qualities of the classroom. It's about the moral purposes. It's about what we're trying to achieve with our teaching, and how we, you know, recognize all children, all learners, and how we can really support them. So I think we've had a long-term problem with this issue that's got in the way of a lot of reform. We do have some solutions, and we have some terrific evidence on it right now. And you know, we did get some bipartisan support prior to the federal election to actually expand the work that we've been doing on quality teaching rounds. So we're really looking forward to the budget announcements later this year, and hoping to you know, work with the new government in establishing what that project might really look like, and see what kind of difference we can make, particularly for those people coming through initial teacher education and into the all-important induction phase, so that we can affect retention and really affect success in the profession, so that teachers thrive. Trying to give a short answer, too much to say.
That's all right. I suspect, Zid, this is where the nudging work of Aero can come into it, because what Jenny's saying, as far as I can tell, is that we have these things in place. We have these bodies of evidence. We have these models. We've got these ways of measuring, but like they might not be understood or known or practiced or used or out there. And so is that what you meant, Zid, when you said, you know, we're there to nudge, we're there to curate evidence, to put it out there for people who may or may not decide to take it up in their own context?
Yes, that is the case. But I think that if I can just take a step back here and note one thing that is true about assessment and measuring across Australia, it's that I think we often conflate measurement and assessment with high stakes consequences and evaluation and judgment. And when we really look at, you know, what's the value of measuring and assessing something, it's really the value is to help us know where we are, so we can know where we need to get to next. And so really, I think that one of the biggest challenges to measuring teaching quality is just getting over the internalized structural concerns that measurement therefore means, you know, hiring, firing, evaluation, all of that sort of thing. And instead flipping that script a little bit and saying, actually, if you don't measure something, if you can't track something, you can't develop it. And that's a lot of what Aero is trying to do in supporting the advancement of teaching quality, is trying to help people think about what do we need to help teachers formatively assess their own practice.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes to go. And there's a whole bunch of questions on there. I'm really sorry to everyone who's submitted questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. What I will say, though, is that there's a lot of threads running through those comments around just how overloaded the work of teachers is at the moment, the different demands that they're facing, whether that's, you know, things to do with the nature of NAPLAN testing or curriculum reform or other areas. And so I just want to acknowledge that and say there's a lot of questions there around, I guess, what you might call change fatigue, you know, a lot going on. I want to ask a final question, though, to the panel. And it's kind of a cheeky question in a way, just a way of wrapping it up. Like, I want you to pretend that you're the education minister, the federal education minister, right? Yeah. And you operate in the perfect federation where if you propose an idea, all the state and territory ministers are going to say, that's a great idea. Let's do exactly that. So if you were the minister and you had one reform that you could guarantee would work, what would you do? So I don't want to throw you in the deep end, Bevan, again. I did that last time. So I might go the other way around. I can't remember what the other way around is actually. Jenny, can I be as bold as to ask you what you would do if you were the minister?
Oh, my easy and cheeky answer, which is not because it's based in 20 years of really rigorous research, is to provide every beginning teacher with an experience of quality teaching rounds to set them up for strong collegial relationships, high quality teaching, and terrific outcomes for their kids. More broadly, that could be part of a national teacher and leader development strategy.
Yeah.
So it depends if you want big or slightly.
No, that's good. And fortunately, in our fantasy world, it's done. We've done
All right.
it.
Yeah.
'Cause you're the minister, everyone's agreeing. So it's happening. Thanks, Jenny.
Sorry,
great.
Glenn, can I just add one more thing though? I
Yeah.
think one of the real benefits of that is that it's one initiative that has multiple broad impacts. We
Right.
keep investing again. I go back to my piecemeal statement, so much little initiatives that might help with, year 5 maths, but we're talking about something that addresses pedagogy in every classroom every day. So not trying to sort of sell the idea, but we do have the evidence that that initiative can make a huge impact.
Yeah, because it has those ripple effects, right? And I think that comes back to the notion of what is the system, like I think if you can, to use a public policy research term, pull certain levers, they're going to have much more impact and ripple than others are going to have. So I really appreciate that point, that this is not just going to be a solution for one thing. It could potentially, have impact more broadly than that. So Zid, can I ask you, Minister, what would you do? What are you going to do in this new environment?
If I can be really bold, I think that the developments in cognitive science over the past 30, 40 years have really helped us become a lot more confident in how people learn, how children learn and develop. And that's really helped us sort of identify what are the teaching practices that are most effective in enabling all children to learn. And so it would be sort of advancing a national sense of what is effective teaching and learning. Right.
Okay, cool. That is bold. I wonder what that would look like in practice. It would be an interesting one. Thanks, Sid. Bevan, what would you do as minister?
I would, I'll talk about NAPLAN here, because this has become its own industry and has gobbled up zillions of dollars over a long period of time now. It's just been used the wrong way. And what's happened is that NAPLAN has actually become a driver for the teaching of literacy and numeracy in schools, and that's definitely what it should not have become. So I'd be putting up a proposition that NAPLAN be revised and possibly returned to its original purpose, which was just to sort of dipstick measure at a point in time of Australian student performance, and encourage teachers to actually forget about it till it comes around and get on with the job of teaching, which they should be doing.
So Bevan, can I ask you, just to push that a little bit further, do you think the problem with NAPLAN is NAPLAN itself, or do you think it's what it's become as an enacted policy beast that's gone out there into the world?
I think it's what it's become, because I think the original intent of NAPLAN as nothing, it does not bear any resemblance to what it is now. And there's a whole industry that's been built up around NAPLAN, and unfortunately, I think it actually encourages poor teaching practice if you focus solely on that.
Because my sense is that ACARA often cops a lot of criticism for things that are going on around NAPLAN that they're not endorsing or promoting themselves. So I think there's an interesting thing around NAPLAN, the technology, the test itself, and then what people do with NAPLAN. So it's a really interesting distinction, I think.
Sorry, Glenn, I'll be very quick. So there's been changes to NAPLAN again for next year. And this is, I think, the gap between the policymakers and what they're trying to do with NAPLAN. And the idea was to get results to parents quicker. So how do we do that? Well, we push NAPLAN earlier in the year to midterm 1. Well, that's not taking into consideration the logistical problems that causes for schools at that time of the year. I mean, at that time of the year, principals are wanting their staff to be developing the relationships with kids, concentrating on those sorts of things without having to worry about an assessment regime.
Thanks, Bevan. Marnie, what would you do as Education Minister?
Look, I think I'll revert to my flexi school space. And I think what would be really important is to go to those school settings, alternative school settings, flexi school settings, where there's this growing cohort of young people who've been pushed out of mainstream schools for a whole variety of reasons. And yet they manage to engage these young people in meaningful ways. So, you know, that varies, of course, but I'd take the lessons from those schools and bring them back to mainstream school settings so that we don't have this array of schooling opportunities in the way that it's transpired. Yeah, that's what I would do.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to wrap up now. So it's nearly 7 o'clock. I'm also itching to know who's winning the Brisbane-Richmond game, so I need to get off quickly. Joking. On behalf of the UWA Graduate School of Education and also on behalf of the UWA Public Policy Institute, I really want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's been a big, rich discussion. And I want to thank our panelists in particular for giving their time on an evening to be here, especially those on the East Coast. These events always take a lot of effort to bring together. And I just wanted to particularly give a shout out to Rebecca Ray from the UWA Public Policy Institute for all the logistics and all the behind the scenes efforts that go into making this a really seamless event, and also for pushing me to keep going with the idea and getting the whole thing up and running. So this event has been recorded, and in about a week, I believe it'll be posted up on YouTube so you can distribute it to all your networks. And I even heard that it's going to be screened on Sky News Extra, which is very exciting. So it'll get out there. As a final note, I just want to say that the conversations we've engaged in today are just the beginning, I think. And I think we're entering a really interesting and hopefully generative phase of thinking about schooling in our nation in some new ways, but also some ways that carry on the gains that we've made over the last decade or so. So thanks for all being here. I greatly appreciate it. Many friends, many colleagues who are here, thank you. And I look forward to continuing these conversations with you into the future. So we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.